An Amish bishop vanished into the woods with his teenage daughter. 3 days later, her body was found, buried, bruised, and 5 months pregnant. No one heard her scream. No one asked where she went. Why? The forest lay still that morning, wrapped in a pale mist, untouched by wind or sound. It was the kind of silence that doesn't just settle over a place. It presses into the soil, hangs from the trees, fills the lungs of those who step inside. Near the edge of a disused trail in northern Lancaster County, beneath a thin layer of disturbed earth, officers uncovered what had once been a girl. The grave was shallow. The ground had been dug by hand. No effort to conceal it beyond what time and nature might offer. Her body was curled, not as if she had been laid to rest, but as if she had been trying to protect herself in her final moments. Charisma Mosby was 18 years old. Her long skirt had been torn, stained with dried blood and mud. Her hands were folded unnaturally across her midsection, not by reverence, but by someone who had rehearsed how to pose the dead. Her fingers were broken. There were contusions along both arms, a split gash across the temple, and clear signs of repeated blunt force trauma to the skull. Defensive wounds indicated she had fought hard. Her eyes were closed, not in peace, but swollen shut. What struck investigators wasn't just the brutality. It was the atmosphere, the quiet. There were no signs of struggle outside the burial site, no drag marks, no trail. It was as if she had walked to her death or had been carried there, and no one had heard a thing. The forensic team confirmed she had been pregnant, 5 months along. The fetus, undeveloped but clearly viable, had suffered internal trauma consistent with the attack. The positioning of her hands over her abdomen suggested awareness. She had known. And perhaps, in her last moments, she wasn't just protecting herself. She was protecting someone else. The discovery rattled even the most seasoned officers, not just because of what had been done, but because of who she was. Charisma Mosby, the bishop's daughter. In the Amish community of Mount Olive, silence isn't just practiced, it's institutionalized. Order is spiritual. Obedience is sacred. Questions are discouraged, and consequences are handled quietly, within. But nothing about this was quiet. The man who had left with her, Elijah Mosby, 56 years old, spiritual leader of the Mount Olive district, had been missing for days. The last sighting of the two had been early one fog-covered morning. No goodbyes, no public announcement, just a father and daughter riding off in a buggy into the mist. And now she was dead. The cabin where they had supposedly gone, a religious retreat house used only by select members of the church, had been found abandoned. No signs of forced entry, no note left behind. But the bedsheets were wrinkled. The table bore the indentation of 2 plates. A single chair had been knocked over. On the windowsill sat a prayer book, its corner torn. Between the pages a piece of lined paper. Faded ink, but still legible. 4 words written in trembling hand. I just want out. That was the beginning of the unraveling. The autopsy marked the cause of death as cranial hemorrhage from repeated blunt force. The murder weapon was never found. But the injuries matched the weight and contour of an old iron lantern, the kind often kept in Amish cabins, used to light the path on long, dark walks through isolated woods. What stood out most, however, was not what was done, but how it was done. Calculated, clean, controlled. The burial, while shallow, was symmetrical. The body had been positioned with care. The wound sites bore no signs of rage. This had not been a crime of passion. This had been methodical. The psychological profile began to take shape long before a suspect had been arrested. Whoever had done this had experience with ritual, order, and restraint. The violence wasn't chaotic. It was executed in silence, with purpose, and with the understanding that no one would question him. Because in Mount Olive, Elijah Mosby was not just a man. He was the voice of God. and for years his voice had gone unquestioned. Until now. Before we continue, make sure to like and subscribe. It really helps us a lot. Thank you. Elijah Mosby had spent over 2 decades shaping the Order of Mount Olive. He wore his authority with quiet precision, never raising his voice, never needing to. When he entered a room, conversations stopped. When he spoke, eyes lowered. He taught obedience not as a virtue, but as a law, one that came from God and flowed through him. He was not a charismatic figure. He didn't charm or persuade. He didn't inspire. What he wielded was certainty. His sermons were long, heavy with scripture, often centered on punishment, on purity, and the price of sin. Those who listened rarely questioned him. Those who did often found themselves removed from favor, or worse, removed from memory. There had been whispers for years, quiet doubts, stories of excessive discipline, children who cried through nights, girls told not to speak too freely, mothers who noticed bruises and were told their children were struggling with temptation. But in Mount Olive, suspicion is a sin, and silence is survival. Charisma had been different. Not rebellious, not loud, just curious. She wrote in the margins of her prayer book. She asked questions about forgiveness, about justice, about the world beyond the fences. She once told her mother she wanted to teach children who couldn't read. Her mother didn't discourage her, but reminded her gently, those were not dreams for girls like her. Still, Elijah took notice. He called her sensitive, said she needed guidance. He began pulling her from group lessons, setting aside time for private devotionals. They started small, brief prayers behind closed doors, spiritual check-ins. But as the months passed, the sessions grew longer. The doors stayed locked. The language became more vague, more personal. He told others she was wrestling with pride, that she needed intensive alignment. No one intervened. No one asked why she flinched when spoken to. Inside the home, routines became rigid. Charisma was expected to rise early, work without pause, pray without question. Privacy was discouraged. Her journal disappeared. The light in her eyes, the one that once drew others in, began to fade. Naomi, her mother, saw it, but she had seen it too late. Elijah maintained control not through violence, but through devotion. That was the brilliance of his mask. Every action could be explained through Scripture. Every hand laid on her shoulder could be framed as blessing. Every locked door could be justified as protection from the outside world. But in the last weeks before her disappearance, something shifted. Charisma began retreating inward. Her movements slowed. Her face appeared fuller. She avoided windows, rarely spoke at dinner. She asked to stay home from church gatherings, a request never made before. Then came the nausea, the unexplained pain. The nights she lay curled on her bed, eyes red from tears she wouldn't explain. Naomi offered tea. She whispered prayers. She asked Elijah if they should seek help. He refused, said their daughter was spiritually afflicted, under attack. He would handle it. He always had. When Naomi found a scrap of paper in her daughter's apron, her hands trembled. The ink was faint, but the words were clear. Father, what we did was wrong, but I don't know what to do now. She didn't confront him. She didn't tell Charisma. She just stood still clutching that torn confession and felt the weight of everything she had not asked, everything she had chosen to believe. 2 days later, Elijah announced they were going away, a retreat, just him and Charisma. He said she needed solitude, that the world had clouded her soul. Naomi offered to come. He declined. Her presence, he said, would distract from what needed to be done. That morning, as the buggy rolled away into the mist, Naomi watched. Charisma looked back once, just once, and then turned away. She never returned. What followed was not chaos. It was calculated quiet. Elijah had learned long ago how to move without question. He had chosen a location known only to the church elders. He had packed provisions, ensured there would be no interruptions, and when he took her life, he did so without frenzy. The fatal blow had been deliberate. A single object, heavy, swung with force and control. Then, methodically, he had buried her, not out of panic, but to end the evidence, to erase the flaw from the narrative. He didn't run. He didn't panic. He waited. For days. Because in his mind, he had done what was necessary. In the psychology of religious abusers, particularly those with unchecked spiritual authority, there exists a pattern, a fusion of belief and control, where the lines between morality and manipulation blur. Elijah believed he was chosen, that his actions were covered not only by Scripture, but by silence, and he was right, for a time. But the moment Naomi walked into that police station, the silence cracked, and once it did, the truth, long buried under the weight of obedience and fear, began to claw its way to the surface. The courtroom in Lancaster County was old. Its walls bore the weight of centuries, its floors groaned beneath quiet feet, and its benches, polished by the friction of history, now held a community that rarely stepped beyond its own wooden thresholds. The air was thick the morning Elijah Mosby entered. He walked with the calm of a man who had led funerals, officiated weddings, presided over the confessions of dozens. There was no hesitation in his step, no remorse etched into the lines of his face, just stillness, the kind that unsettles because it does not match the gravity of what surrounds it. He sat, alone, his coat neatly buttoned, his eyes forward. Naomi was already there. She had arrived early, choosing a seat where sunlight fell in through tall, arched windows. She wore black. Her hands rested on her lap. In her pocket was the note her daughter had written. In her mind, the last look Charisma gave before disappearing into the fog. The prosecution did not open with arguments. They opened with the journal. A projector illuminated each page, casting Charisma's handwriting across the courtroom wall. Her words, written in careful script, trembled as they were read aloud. "I want to be good, but I feel wrong all the time. I think God sees me, but I don't know if He hears me. And then, I love Him, but I hate how I feel when He prays over me." Some in the audience looked away. Others clenched their hands, their expressions unreadable. Elijah did not move. The defense attempted to shift the narrative. They called upon elders who described him as a man of conviction, misunderstood by the modern world. They painted Charisma as emotionally fragile, struggling under the pressure of expectations. But none of it held. The weight of her words was too heavy. When Naomi was called to the stand, the room seemed to still. Her voice was quiet, deliberate. She didn't speak of rage. She didn't speak of vengeance. She spoke of missed signs, of nights spent listening to muffled cries, of mornings when her daughter winced without explanation. She described the final day, how Elijah said Charisma needed his guidance, how he denied Naomi's presence on the trip, how she stood at the door holding her breath and knew something was ending. In her testimony, she did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. The truth, when spoken plainly, carries its own echo. The final piece of evidence came from Charisma's sketchbook, recovered from the cabin. Folded between pages of hymns and scripture was a single drawing. A girl behind a window, her hands pressed to the glass. Beneath it, one word, help. The verdict came swiftly. Guilty on all counts. First-degree murder, sexual assault, incest, concealment of a body. Elijah showed no emotion. As the sentence was read, life imprisonment without parole, he remained seated, unmoved. Perhaps in his mind, the silence that had protected him for decades would somehow return. But it didn't. What followed was not celebration. There were no cheers, no vindication, only the sound of one woman exhaling, and the beginning of a long, uncertain grief. The impact on Mount Olive rippled like cracks in stained glass. Elijah's name was removed from church records, his sermons erased, his portrait taken down. But silence remained. Some members whispered that the devil had confused the girl, that Naomi had betrayed her place. Others began to question, quietly, then louder. They held small gatherings, read from journals, wrote letters they would never have dared before. Naomi never returned to the community. She settled in a small town outside Baltimore, in a modest apartment above a bookstore. She worked quietly, lived simply, and every night she lit a candle by the window, not for forgiveness, not for peace, but for charisma, for the voice that was buried once in silence, and now, finally, heard.